What questions are you wrestling with at the moment?
These kind of existential questions I think all of us are asking right now, kind of what does it mean to live life and do what we're called to do in this, place, an odd place that we find ourselves in right now. I mean, more specifically, I guess, we can talk more about kind of the work I'm doing and the way, we were introduced and stuff in a little bit more detail. But I find that the majority of the work that I'm doing now, just more generally, is helping people make connections and making things relevant in the sense, not relevant in the sense of, translate. Well, I don't know. I should have a better soundbite for this, but it's more about, we say we believe this, and this is part of kind of the public theology side of it. We say we believe this. What then does that actually mean? Like, how do we actually live that out in practice? What kind of impact then does that have on our lives and the lives of those around us? When we read the text, what kind of, and by text I mean kind of the Bible or sacred text, what impact does that then have? How do we make that real in our lives in a way that is healthy, gives life, gives generativity, and doesn't bring death and destruction? There's got to be something that is life-giving, joy-giving about it. And so giving people permission to kind of look for those things in ways in which they can make it their own and say, right, for this context, this is how we could do this, feels really important right now, for a lot of people that I'm working with. So.
And so when you read the texts, where does it spring life for you? In what directions does it take it? What kind of sphere of life do you intrinsically kind of go to first?
So because of the work that I do around public theology and the fact that the public tends to have kind of more negative impressions of religion or ways in which the Bible gets read, I do tend to probably deal with more of the more problematic stuff than I do the easy stuff, as it were. But I think what is giving me life right now and in my teaching too is, and so I grew up, this is also probably part of context, I grew up Southern Baptist, fundamentalist, really conservative. The Bible is what it is. You don't question it. You read it literally, that kind of stuff. And it's been a process of kind of, deconstruction, reconstruction is usually how it gets described, but process of conversion could also be talked about in that way. And now what gives me life is really noticing where the Bible is a conversation with itself. So like one of the lectures that I do quite regularly is the ways in which kind of Ruth and Jonah were written at the same time, and Ezra and Nehemiah. And both Ezra and Nehemiah are these really quite xenophobic, divorce your foreign wives, it's only for us, this, really inward focused stuff. Whereas Ruth and Jonah are like, God's for everybody, and the Moabites and the Ninevites matter too. And the fact that both of those are kind of written at the same time and are in reaction to one another, I think ends up, and I spend most of my time in the Hebrew Bible as well, the richness of that is so much more life-giving to me than it ever was back when I was reading it for a single truth, a single thing, and making it all agree with itself and tying myself up in knots to make that work. Now that I feel like I have the freedom to read it and wrestle with it and go, sins of the fathers will be visited on multiple generations. No, the sins of the person are the sins of the person. No, like there's a whole conversation about that happening as well. And I just love that. I love that we don't have it all figured out. We've all been wrestling with it all this time, trying to make sense of this life we live. And that gives me space, I think.
I think it's fair to say it's very easy to see that you love it.
I'm really enthusiastic
as you get more animated as you talk about it. It reminded me, I moved 15 years ago to Leeds, and when we moved to Leeds, we moved into a low-income neighbourhood. And I remember reading the Old Testament like it had become this imagination factory. and it was like it was like a conversion experience of how to read the Bible, because the context in some ways said, actually it's throwing up a whole bunch of other questions that you can bring to the text, and the text can actually speak back. From your Southern Baptist roots, we don't want the whole lineage, but was there a moment where what was the significant thing in you discovering that this is a conversation? Because that's quite a long way away from Southern Baptist.
Oh, yeah. I don't know that I had a Damascus Road experience, as it were. I went to, was homeschooled, went to a really small Southern Baptist university. But after that, I went with the International Mission Board, Southern Baptist Organization, to be a missionary, but I went to Bosnia, and that was from 1998 until 2000. So the war had finished in 95. But it was still very much, peacekeeping troops and stuff everywhere. It was highly militarized. It was the first time this little kid from, American South didn't even meet a Catholic until I'd gone to university. And here I am surrounded by Orthodox, Catholic, Jew, Muslim. And that was really formative for me. It was just being somewhere else, seeing the world through somebody else's eyes was just really, really important. And finding out and seeing that some of my Muslim colleagues seem to have a better relationship and more upstanding kind of place in the community, better relationship with God, and then their role in the world seemed more positive than some of my Baptist colleagues. So that kind of started to really start making me question what was going on. So I felt called to ministry while I was there. As a woman, I was not allowed. So I was like, okay, where do I go? And apparently I wasn't aware of it at the time, but now I do. Baptist is quite a wide tent in the States, and there were some folks who were willing to take me in. So I went to Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond, and that's where Richmond became home. It was like, finally, I am able to be who I think I have always been, but just never really had the space to do it, and really kind of square peg round hole for a long time. Asked questions, but was never given any kind of answers. We're never given space to ask the questions safely, I think is probably more the big thing. And it's just been a journey from there, to be honest.
I'm struck by the fact that relocation actually in your journey as well was a part of that, but it's sometimes where you relocate and the struggle that's around actually forces questions to develop. I want us to spend a bit of time just earlier this year. You probably edited it last year, but it was published, a book that you've been one of the editors of, called When Did We See You Naked? I
have it to hand just in case.
Excellent. From all good bookshops, I would imagine. Jayme, do you want to just, because obviously it's an edited piece, so it's a range of different authors. So it's not like there's just one message, but what are some of the main messages that come through the book?
It's a piece of work that I'm immensely proud of, but also know that it's I was about to say it's dangerous. It is dangerous in the sense of whatever notions you might have had, I think can be quite challenged by the piece. And so I'm careful who I talk to about it with, just because I do know that it brings up a lot. And like we were talking about, taking care of yourself in the midst of it as well. So the general premise arises from some scholarship of one of my co-editors. So David Toombs was one of the first to really do some work on this. And he is a liberation theologian. He was my PhD supervisor. So I'm trained in liberation and feminist theologies, where I spend most of my time. And so his work, so as a liberation theologian, he was reading kind of the stories of torture and political violence that's happening in Central America, especially El Salvador and Guatemala during the 80s and early 90s. And just kind of, looking at the ways in which the church was responding to those kind of political situations. And noticed that there was some narratives that were written down about the experiences of people that really quite resonated with how he read the crucifixion narrative, in the sense that the use of state terror, the use of this overarching power, so whether or not it's the governments in Central America or whether it's the Roman Empire, would use certain tactics as a means to subdue a people, to shame them, to keep them under control, to exert power and coercion over them. And that the use of sexual abuse and sexual violence was one of those means by which they did that. And so he started, and that's well documented. I mean, in my case in Bosnia, the stories of the rape camps and that kind of stuff was part, everything, we all have heard that story now, I think, on the whole. And so that resonated with me, obviously. And so we've been kind of working on this together for quite some time. And so, I started going back and looking at the crucifixion narrative. What do we know about the Roman Empire? What do we know about some of the historical stuff that's there? And then just started reading the text. And it became really quite clear that Jesus is stripped multiple times in front of at least probably 200, if not more, soldiers, at least. So when, I can pull up the text if we want to look at it, but it says in Matthew and Mark that the whole cohort is called, and the whole cohort is between 200 and 300 soldiers at least. It could be up to 500. Instances of Abu Ghraib and other situations, we know that when those kinds of things happen, sometimes a prisoner who is being tortured is not treated in the most upstanding of ways. And so we, imagination, the text doesn't say anything beyond the stripping. So then we started thinking about, well, hang on a second though. If someone is publicly stripped in front of anyone, really, but certainly, in that kind of situation, is that not sexual abuse, actually? Because the point of that is to humiliate someone, to denigrate them in a particular way, using nakedness as a sexually vulnerable type of situation. It's an action of coercion and violence. Now, when your child, you have to strip your child because of a fever or something like that. It's not the same thing. That's not what we're saying. Stripping in and of itself, it's the public act of doing it in front of, forced public stripping, is what we're thinking. Actually, hang on a second. When this happens in other situations, we call it sexual violence. And so the collection of chapters that we have in the book are from all over the world. So David's now in New Zealand. We had a couple other folks who are from Australia and New Zealand who contributed, survivors who, as well as folks who have been declared, may or may not be, biblical scholars, poetry. So Padre Gatuma did a chapter based on the 10 stations of the cross, because the stripping of Jesus is station number 10. Womanist, and just loads of people. We have, so one particular example, one of the authors is from Botswana, and there is a situation in which women who are deemed to be dressed too provocatively are publicly stripped while waiting for the bus in the queue, and being shamed because of how they are dressed. Again, that's called sexual violence in that context. And so, we just kind of use this story to look at the ways in which There are things that are hidden in plain sight, things that we read over that text over and over and over again every year.
Yeah, almost like you skip over that bit.
Yeah. We have a stripping of the altar every year.
Yeah.
What in the world are we doing when we do that? Not saying we shouldn't, but there's a meaning there that we are missing.
Yeah.
And so it feels important to kind of say, right, the text notes it, and that it happens multiple times. What do we then do with that? Yeah.
Thanks for kind of just mapping that out for us. I'm interested in your reaction as you uncover that, and as you kind of start to see that, and knowing a little bit about you, where that might resonate with your own experiences. And I wondered if you just wanted to share something around that.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote the introduction to the book and kind of try to set the framework for it. And some of the contributors are speaking to their own audiences wherever it is they are, but a lot of the public speaking around it, myself and David and Rocio, the other editors, do mostly. For me, I mean, I am a victim or survivor of sexual abuse myself within a church context. And it's funny, the whole scandal about Southern Baptists this past year has been like, yeah, well, we've been telling you that for a long time, for me though, it's been really interesting that, well, I'm intrigued by people's responses, and so we can talk about that in a little bit more detail if you want. But I think for me too, before I really started working on this project, I was already, because of my experience in Bosnia, because of my experience in Belfast, and being really sensitive to violence and the effects of violence, I had already started asking questions around what in the world is this atonement thing? How do we make sense of that? And all the different theories, there's loads actually. There's 5 or 6 ways in which that has been framed in the church over the course of the centuries, and not really finding a satisfactory answer to it. And so I had kind of been thinking about how I felt about those kind of last days of Jesus anyway. And then to add this on top of it, I was just like, oh, I just don't know what I want to do with that. What I have found, I'm careful about the use of redemptive, so that word, but what I have found redemptive about this process is hearing how others have made meaning out of it. And sometimes that meaning is, it actually doesn't have any meaning, but this is how I need to go on, so just the way in which those stories, they've taken this and made it something for themselves has been really quite, well, kind of like the text and conversation with itself. That the conversation is actually what the redemption is for me, in the sense of we are still just trying to figure this out and doing the best we can. And so I know some might find that unsatisfactory, but for me, that's about the best I can do right now. And then too, I like talking about the responses and stuff. I guess the other thing I'm kind of wrestling with is just the way in which people do respond sometimes makes me wonder, have we made an idol out of Jesus? Like whatever it is, that conception that we have, and we see it too, like stuff with Black Lives Matter and with Black theology and talking about Jesus being Black and how people respond to that kind of thing. It's like, not my Jesus isn't Black, or not my Jesus, he wasn't sexually abused, or whatever it is, these conceptions that we have of who Jesus was. And as soon as you start to kind of ask questions about that, people get really head up about it, and so then it kind of makes me go, all right, so who is your Jesus, and what's going on there? what is it about him being male, or him being perfect, or, like all of the ways in which we talk about Jesus that, might well be true, but might not be. So let's kind of think about what meaning we're giving to those kind of identifying characteristics that we have for him. And so, that's something I'm kind of struggling with. Who exactly was he, and what's important for me about who he was and how he lived? And I don't know that any of that makes any sense, but that's
and in some ways it's probably not meant to make sense.
It's not probably.
In some ways it's meant to provoke the nonsense that we carry around in our heads so much of the time. You've mentioned it a couple of times, that there, I think you even made the Church Times over this.
Lucky me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that some of us dream of. But no, I don't. But I'm interested in, there has been quite a lot of criticism to what the book's trying to do.
Yeah.
I'm interested. What are some of the critiques that are coming back?
So what's interesting is, and I think actually it's probably better to start with positives. Right. And this isn't me trying to dodge the question, because we can deal with those. But the positives are that, and we have actually, as far as responses go, legitimate responses to the actual book rather than off the cuff remarks from people who haven't read it, which is where most of the negative stuff is coming from. But people who have actually read it, positive stuff has been overwhelmingly more. And so when I start to kind of get down about it, I'm like, oh, but then I think about who actually has read it, then okay, yeah, I can deal. And the positives are the number of people who were or are victims or survivors themselves, who are able to see themselves in it and go, oh my goodness, yeah. So one of the chapter titles is from some interviews that one of my co-editors did. So Rocio and David did these interviews with women who had been in orders, so nuns, but who had been abused. And one of the phrases were, in seeing his innocence, I see my innocence. So up until that point, that she was still, even though rationally she knew she hadn't done anything wrong, there was still a point at which she was still blaming herself, that there must have been something that was there. And then for her to get to a point where it's like, Jesus was also innocent, and I have no problem with that. And but now I'm able to, make that connection in a way that she hadn't been able to do before. And we've heard from quite a few folks who have said something similar, or people who who haven't had direct experience themselves, but who work with folks who have been, or people who are in ministry who maybe, haven't had that kind of experience, but just, are trying to live and lead really sensitive ministries, and are seeing how we just kind of traipse over this quite a bit. So that has been, I would say, overwhelmingly the majority of legitimate responses we've gotten have been positive. Then the negative stuff, well, I'll say, actually, though, the biggest is silence. People don't say anything. So yes, there's been the one article in Church Times, and there's been a review from Robin Gill, also in the Church Times, but there actually hasn't been that much, to be honest, considering what it was. And so, the silence, we don't know how to interpret, because we just don't know if people just don't want to touch it, or if they're dealing with it in their own way. And, I know of one group who is reading it together. They haven't been in touch with us to tell us anything. As far as I know, they're not publishing anything about it. But, we don't get that feedback. So I have no idea. The more negative stuff, like I said, tends to be people who haven't actually read it, and they are responding immediately. And again, kind of makes me wonder what else is going on there. Because I know it can be triggering for folks, and I think it has been in some ways. I think those who are from more evangelical kind of approaches to, you know, what Jesus went through was in those final days was meant to be, that we find some kind of divine meaning and salvation from that. And I'm not saying that that's right or wrong, but just saying those who have that kind of really quite high view of the atonement, Jesus consented to all the stuff that was going on. You know, if you have that kind of idea, then that becomes much more problematic and much more provocative for you. A couple of the other more extremes. So Twitter was talking about how, one person talked about the work as being satanic, but again, they hadn't read it. And one of them, another person responded saying that it feminized Christ by calling him a victim of sexual abuse, which I found, yeah. Okay. Well, one, would that be a bad thing? But two, and there's a chapter in the book from Nicholas Lee, who's at Queen's, on the risen Christa, and kind of feminine imagery that's used often in feminist theology. So I think there's a good connection to be made there. But yeah, this feminizing Christ idea, only women are victims of sexual abuse. We know that's not true. So there, like, it gets back to have we made an idol out of Jesus's masculinity, out of whiteness, out of his imperviousness to what, you know, like, and even the Gospels kind of contribute to that, because we get a different version of Jesus in every story. John, he's kind of in control of the situation. He's almost interrogating Pilate, you know, like there's something going on. But John's theology is much higher. Jesus is something much more, or the silence of Jesus, and and the lamb being led to slaughter, and he doesn't defend himself at all. And then in others, he's quite talkative. So there is just a really interesting thing going on that I just don't think we pay enough attention to.
Thanks, Jayme. That's really, it's helpful to kind of reflect on some of the instinctive responses of people, which I think having heard that, and you told me about the feminizing thing the other day when we talked, and I still felt shocked when you said it then.
I can show you the tweet. I've got it up if you want to see it.
I don't think I want to see the tweet.
Yeah.
But in some ways it I think I'm with you. I think it does betray this kind of very sealed view of Christ that we have, that we don't let Christ surprise us.
We haven't figured out.
Why
do we think we have him figured out?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really interested in, we start this conversation by saying you're a public theologian, and then this is the piece of work that's really been taking your attention. Can you connect those two things for me a little bit? What is this saying into the public, and using that in a very broad sense?
Well, I think there's a multiplicity of ways in which it could respond. I'll pick a couple. So, the way in which I think about public theology is helping the public have access to theological resources that they might not otherwise have. So helping them think theologically in the sense of making meaning that isn't necessarily asking them to come to church. So there's that. But also then thinking about how the church does its work in a way that has public impact, or thinking about the impact of what it is they say they do. So I think, and from the kind of the public looking in, this talking about the Jesus idea, this triumphalistic Jesus that I think a lot of people sometimes have difficulty identifying with, or, that I think he tends to, he's appropriated by the church maybe in that way that, and it just makes it hard to identify, I think. So in being able to notice that he bled, he, had experiences that many have had. I don't think Jesus needed to go through every experience known to man in order to identify with, Jesus having cancer or something. I don't think we necessarily need to do that, but I think representation is important for folks. And so if there's ways and means for them to find a way in, then I think that's important. And so there's that. The other thing, though, that I think is probably the more the goal that I guess we've been kind of working toward is helping the church to understand the ways in which it is responding to victims of sexual violence that are unhelpful. So a church may well say, that they don't have, or individuals within the church, congregations, such, they say, we have no intentions, we don't want to stigmatize victims or anything like that. Yet when we start to say, well, what about Jesus? There's an automatic, well, he couldn't have been. Or we think that he's less in some way because of it, which then is like, then hang on. There is a stigmatization. There is shame. There is something to be hidden or not paid attention to. I can't say la, 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 la. It's kind of what happens. And if that's the case, then that is also happening in how we respond to people in our communities and in our congregations. And there needs to be something done about that. And so the ways in which the church could respond more appropriately, first and foremost, but more holistically, more caringly, and with a recognition of its own role in denying the truth of what's happening in relation to, the scandals, but also just the statistics, right? At least 1 in 4 women, half usually of LGBT, transgendered, and disabled folks are, so at what, and well, we could transgender and LGBT, we could say a whole lot more about how the church has responded to that too. But, just to say, there is such a large number of people in our communities who are hurting and who have had this kind of experience, and the church is saying jack about it on the whole, or hasn't said enough. Some are starting to. The Methodists are doing a good job, I think, at least starting to do some of the safeguarding stuff, but the bar is so low. There's so much more to do. So this is a means by which to give people some resources and some hooks and some ways in to be thinking about it that I don't think we've really had. And the conversation hasn't been had, to be honest. So somebody has to start it somewhere, somehow. Maybe this is a way in.